G'day, Trooper Cody and Steve with a light horse video, and in one of my other videos I mentioned the 13th Light Horse Regiment and the one squadron of the 4th Light Horse Regiment going to the Western Front, keeping their horses and being in action the entire time they were on the Western Front, right up until the 11th of the 11th, 1918. So basically a few things happened that are really important to mention about the Australian Light Horse on the Western Front, and that is that on the 21st of March 1918, Operation Michael commenced. Operation Michael was a massive, all-out German push to win the war. They had accumulated all the troops, aircraft, munitions. It was going to be the end of the war. It took the Allies completely by surprise and unexpected. It smashed through the Allied trench system, and it started as a complete debacle and a rout for the Allied troops. Again, this is one of those things that if you want to, you can look this up yourself. The French High Commander in the French Army made a stand, massive battle, horrendous losses, but it is seen as the pivotal point, the French commander with the French troops, of stopping the German offensive. And once it stopped and was turned back, it was a case that the Germans were really spent. They had used up everything they had in a giant push, and when it came to a standstill, it was over. It's sort of a bit like World War II, Battle of the Bulge. Germans, massive push, massive shock to the Allies, pushed back, and then suddenly, blah, the Germans just run out of steam, and the Allies quickly take back everything that was lost. So what happened is, as the Germans are falling back, it becomes what's known as the 100-day offensive. And they call it the 100-day offensive mainly because they had to give it a name afterwards, after it was over, because there was no specific battle to call it by that name. There was no specific location to call it so it simply became later. The best way to describe it is the 100-day offensive. Now, this meant that for once the Allies were pushing forward, but it was very fluid because there was no set lines anymore. What would happen is there would be a big push by some British or Australian, Canadian, American, big push by the troops, and then there'd try to be a bit of a weak counterattack by the Germans, and nobody knew where anybody was. And this was when the Light Horse, the New Zealand Mounted Rifles, the 13th Regiment, the Squadron of the 4th, this is when they again came into their own, and they could ride, gallop around, they could work out where front lines were, where particular groups of Allied soldiers were. If groups of Allied soldiers had perhaps penetrated too far, they could tell them that they should perhaps move back because there was a chance they could possibly be cut off. And so that was where many medals were given to officers and men for some of their outstanding contributions they made during the 100-day offensive of riding around the battlefield and being able to quickly, it's a time of tough communication. There is no wireless really, there is only wired communication. The fastest way to keep the High Command, the front line High Command, aware of what was going on was by having troopers on horseback that could quickly relay messages and bring up the latest information. And so while we're talking about the 100-day offensive, it's really well worth talking about. It's not the Light Horse, but it is still Australian troops, and that is the Australian troops created a thing that was called Peaceful Penetration. It's a funny sort of a name, Peaceful Penetration. But what it was the Australians found that now the lines were in complete disarray, small groups of Australians could see where some German activity was taking place, sneak past it, come round it from behind, and simply ask the Germans to surrender. And this was such an effective tactic, it got given the term peaceful penetration. It became a game in the Australian Army that blokes would go out to see who could get the most prisoners. Everyone volunteered, everyone wanted to be involved in this. Can you imagine, you've been on the Western Front in the hell of the mud and the trenches and the water, you've been in this for years. And suddenly, it's not like that anymore. There's more mobility. You're not stuck in a muddy hole. And when you go round and find the groups of Germans, they willingly surrender. You might think this is exaggerated, or I'm telling a story, and other countries might say, oh, come on, did that really happen? And so what I quote, so, the German Chief of Staff on the 13th of July 1918 wrote that the Australians continually succeed in penetrating our lines and taking prisoners from various posts and pickets, and are doing this even in daylight. They are taking the majority of entire divisions in our front lines. We must urge our troops to undertake these same tactics. German Chief of Staff, written report, still exists to this day, says the Australians are doing this, says that it's undermining morale, and he urges the Germans to do the same thing, try to sneak through and capture the... Never happened. So that's what the German records say. And then General Herbert Plummer, the commander of the British Second Army, in a written report, says there is no division in the whole British Army that has done more to destroy the morale of the enemy than the 1st Australian Division. And as an example where the fun and games of all this, it doesn't really look like he's thinking this is fun and games. The fun and games of all this is that 2 officers took 4 men each and went out separately on a peaceful penetration to see who would win the game. Now, when the men came back, because it was so successful and because it was put up for medals, there isn't actually an official record of who won the competition. But what happened is 2 officers went out separately on a peaceful presentation, and they only had 4 diggers each with them. When they came back, they brought back with them 8 German officers, 100 German prisoners, and 8 Maxim machine guns. It was put up for medals because it was such a successful, so talked about amongst the troops. And I don't know how often this happens, but each officer got the military medal, and the 8 diggers that went out, all 8 of them got Distinguished Service Medal. That's how successful peaceful penetration, that's how successful peaceful penetrations were by the Australians, that the Australians get mentioned by name by the German Chief of Staff, get mentioned by Herbert Plummer, commander of the British Second Army, and also receive those medals for that one little outing. And the last story I'll leave you with about peaceful presentations is an absolute gem, because if you've got a good imagination, maybe if you've seen Blackadder, the First World War Blackadder, you imagine some pompous, snobbish, red-tabbed, high command British officers getting together to plan their next attack. And in charge of them was Douglas Haig himself, one of the biggest of the head honchos. And this was on the 11th of July. And he called all his high-ranking officers around him. And again, forgive me if I do not pronounce this properly, but the plan was he wanted to take the Villiers Brennano Plateau. And as they started planning how they were going to take this plateau, a junior ranking officer interrupted Haig. And you can imagine, can't you, some lieutenant, excuse me sir, and some snobbish some snobbish general, we're trying to plan, what, how dare you interrupt? And the thing was, Haig was planning to take, how they were going to take this plateau, and the little lieutenant had to say, I'm sorry sir, the Australians have already taken it. That's the last story I'll tell you about the 100-day offensive. Australian troops, New Zealand troops of course, but the Australian light horse heavily involved with numbers of riders getting medals as well from that. Alrighty. Might have to wake the lad up. Till next time, make sure you subscribe, okay? Cheers, thank you.